Hello, this is Mr. Seymour again, and the second part of this week's lecture deals with your Chapter 1 from the textbook, the Bianco textbook, Bianco and Canon, and it deals with the definition and an understanding of government and politics. And I always like to say that one of these is the noun and the other is the verb. Government is going to be the institutions and the people that make up those institutions. And politics is going to be about process and actions, or inaction in some cases. So let's start by looking at some definitions. Most people have a really hard time separating these two terms. Politics is an active process, process of engagement. When someone is involved in politics, they are involved in decision making, they are involved in the creation of policy, and oftentimes they are seeking office or using the tools of their office. Whereas government is the institutions that we create and the laws that we create and the people who form those institutions that we place into office for us. Now, there are several definitions that we can look at. Let's look at the author's definition, your textbook author, Bianco and Canon. They define politics as the process that determines what a government does. Pretty simplistic. The process that determines what a government does. Now, the previous textbook that we used for this course was written by Edwards and Lineberry, and you actually may have that book in front of you. The alternate definition then is a process that determines who we select as our governmental leaders and what policies they pursue. So in this case, the authors are saying that it's about choosing who represents you. And then after they're chosen, it's about the actions that they take on your behalf. That is another way of looking at politics. What these have in common is that the idea of politics is that it is a process. It's the verb. The most popular among political scientists is Harold Laswell's definition. And Harold Laswell is an economist, a political economist, and he says simply politics is about who gets what, when, and how. And it's about the distribution of resources and services. When you think politics, a lot of times people just really get turned off. Why do most people dislike politics? Well, for one thing, they think it's too complicated. For another, they think it's just full of argument and fighting. Now, this is where we get into this problem that I discussed in the last lecture of hyperpluralism, where you get too many voices, too loud, and everybody shouts each other out, nothing gets accomplished, and we end up with what happened to us last April, where we literally shut government down. Why? We don't know why, but we just don't agree that in what's going to happen, so we just shut government down. So the solution, the idea of politics, is that through discourse, argument, discussion, through the process of wanting to get a policy implemented, several different sides of the argument are going to be heard. You will have debate and compromise. The perception that politicians are only in it for themselves is pretty common amongst people when you ask them what they think of politics or what politics is. So now let's look at government. It comes from the word in Greek, which is to steer the ship, to govern. Webster's dictionary defines government as the lawful control over the affairs of a political unit, such as a nation. It's also defined as the act or activity of looking after and making decisions about something. Bianco and Canon, your authors, define it as a system of implementing decisions through the political process. Edwards and Lineberry, the previous authors that we used in our courses, define it as the institutions and the processes through which public policies are made for a society. Now, when we look at governments, there are different forms. Like the monarchy, which is one ruler who generally inherits that position, like a king or a queen. It's the oldest form of government that we have. Now, how do we separate a monarch from a dictator? A dictator takes and exercises that authoritarian power. An absolute monarch is still somebody who exercises authoritarian power, but they generally inherit the position. The term aristocracy is used to describe rule by a select group. Today, we would call this elitism, or the elitist theory of government, which we'll talk about. So it's generally associated with elitist theory. And then we have the idea of polity, which really has a lot to do with our form of American government, the constitutional republican form. It involves things like the separation of powers, breaking things down into legislative, judicial, and executive branches. Federalism, which is a sharing of power between a national, state, and local level. The rule of law, which is our Constitution and all of its accompanying laws. And the idea of popular sovereignty, where government is supposed to report to the people. The people don't report to their government. The government reports to the people in popular sovereignty. Why do we have governments? There are two sides to the arguments about what government is supposed to do. And we oftentimes see these arguments taking place between different factions or groups. One side of this argument is that governments exist to protect us from ourselves. The most famous of the philosophers that proposed this type of government would have been Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes lived during the English Revolution and in the 1500s and early 1600s. And what happens was that he lived in a world where he said that life was short, brutish, and full of misery. His idea was that government is there to protect people from themselves because people by their nature are bad. There is a contract in Hobbes's view of government that says that the people should be beholden to the government because the government's job is to keep the people from hurting themselves. Another man, John Locke, comes along in the late 1600s, early 1700s to mid 1700s, and he says, very famously, that men are born with rights at the time of their birth. They are born into a perfect state of nature, and that perfect state of nature entitles men to the rights of life, liberty, and property. And of course, we know that maybe that influenced Thomas Jefferson when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, just a tad. Of course, I say that facetiously. All right, so why do we have government? Well, one reason is to provide order. In our Constitution, one of the purposes of government is to ensure domestic tranquility. Another is to provide for the common defense. That's to protect us from outside invasion. Ensuring domestic tranquility is to protect us from ourselves. Another is to establish justice, which is a fair and equitable means of implementing laws and rules. James Madison, the the father of the Constitution, said that in order to eliminate one group having more power than another, we need to mitigate the power of factions. And to do that, we have things like the separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, and Republican form of government where we elect our representatives. Another purpose of government is to provide for the general welfare. Again, today in our country, there's a disagreement. Is the government's purpose to provide services to the people, and if you don't have the ability to take care of yourself, should the government be the safety net? Others would say, no, you should take care of yourself, pull yourself up from the bootstraps. I had a student one time who rose her hand up at this part of the class and said, but what if I don't have any boots? Is it the government's job to provide you with those boots so that you can pull yourself up from the bootstraps? Or is it your job to go out there and take care of yourself? Taking on hard problems that people can't or won't solve on their own is one way that the government helps to provide for the general welfare. Delivering public goods. Public goods we're going to define here in just a little bit, but defense is probably the most important public good. And that is that we all benefit from this good because the government has to provide us with a common defense, yet we don't all have to contribute equally to that common defense. Some give much more than others. A public good is a service or an action that, when it is provided to one person, has to be available to everybody. And the government provides these goods because economically there's no incentive in the free market usually to provide them. So the examples of public goods are national defense, police, fire services, roads, parks, etc. The collective action problem, though, is another situation where we look at one group benefiting more than another. It's a situation where members of a group would benefit by working together to produce some kind of an outcome, but each individual turns out better by refusing to cooperate and reaping the benefits from those who do not do the work, or who do the work. So this we call a free rider, or the free rider problem. For instance, I can drive on a road just as much as anybody else, but if I don't pay taxes, no one can stop me from driving on that road unless it's a toll road, of course. So do we just build toll roads, or do we build up public roads? Now, in politics and in political science, the most famous example of collective action problems is the prisoner's dilemma. Now, imagine, in the prisoner's dilemma, imagine, if you will, that we have a group of people, two or more, that have somehow been implicated in possibly doing something wrong or against the law. So these people are brought in for questioning, and the police separate them. They separate the prisoners into different distinct cells or groups apart from each other. And then they play one end against the other, and they say, look, your partner is in there right now talking to my partner. If he gives you up, you're going to lose. If you give him up first, you're going to win. So if each prisoner cooperates with each other, everybody would go free. But if any one prisoner does not cooperate and decides to rat out the other, then that person would probably benefit from a plea deal, whereas the other person would probably do the full time in prison. The incentive to benefit from another person's work without making a contribution, which leads individuals into what we call a collective action, to refuse to work together, or the prisoner's dilemma. I'll take the plea deal. For example, anyone can use a public road, but not everybody pays the taxes for that road. What do governments do? Well, first they create and they enforce laws. They protect private property through our criminal justice system. If you get something stolen from you, you want the government, the police, to step in and help you get it back. They establish a common currency and they regulate commerce among the states and they regulate trade with other nations. That's what our government does. It provides public goods or services that would not be produced or provided, or they would be undersupplied by the free market. And that includes national defense, interstate highways, and national parks. They regulate marketplace. We do not have a totally free market. There are times when one group will benefit more than another, like in the case of a monopoly. And so generally we have to keep from what's called market failure, like monopolies and oligopolies. When you take economics, if you aren't already taking it, you'll realize that no truly free market exists. There has to be a role for government to help make sure that the playing ground is fair. Somebody always loses. Or in economics, we always say there is no such thing as a free lunch. Somebody pays. Another purpose of government is to protect individual civil liberties, like freedom of speech and free exercise of religion. Your textbook gives about 3 or 4 key ideas. So let's look at the first key idea. The first key idea from your book is that politics is full of conflict. And without conflict, we cannot reach that point of compromise. Conflict is everywhere, and it should be a healthy part of the system, where we reach debate, compromise, and pluralism, allowing all of the voices to be heard. The second idea is that the political process makes a difference. It matters. Primary example is elections. The election of the year 2000, when most of you were very young, resulted in George Bush basically being anointed president by the Supreme Court. Now, some people might disagree with that argument, but the Supreme Court made the final decision because everything was so even. And there was a problem with some of the votes in the state of Florida. And those votes, those very few votes, less than 250, made all of the difference. So let's look at something like in the Senate. We're going to talk about the ideas of filibusters and cloture. Filibusters, when you get the right to talk until you talk things to death. A cloture is the process that we use to stop a filibuster. And in the Senate, it requires 60 votes rather than just a simple majority. Why? Because in the Senate, they deal with very big issues, and the Senate has more latitude. So the recent log jams that we saw in government, what we would refer to as policy gridlock, are a good example of how politics can lead to not such a good outcome. Eventually, they had to reach a compromise because otherwise there would be no government to provide. A third key idea is politics is everywhere. It helps sort out who can do what, when, and how. Remember the definition that we had from Laswell, who gets what, when, and how. Read the paper. You're going to see examples at every level, the state, the local, and the national. And I'm going to ask you to consider during the semester, as you look at the paper or as you look at your current events, what is happening in terms of the political process. Now let's talk a little bit about economies and economics. The first principle of economics is the principle of laissez-faire, which is French for let it alone or leave it alone. And this is the idea that governments should leave the marketplace alone and not be involved. That's a truly free market economy. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to implement because somebody always has an advantage. A command economy would be something like the former Soviet Union, with its communist form of government or communist form of economics, where the government decides what's going to be made, who can buy it, who can sell it, and at what price, and it doesn't answer to the people answer to the government. Now, a mixed economy is what we have in the United States. And in this type of an economy, government is somewhat involved in the marketplace, but we believe that it's there to act in the public interest, to keep the marketplace free, open, and fair. Economic interests. In a free market economy, government is not supposed to get involved. Economic individualism is the ability to freely make, buy, and sell products, and to keep profits from your economic activity. Then there are policies that talk about redistribution, tax policies, where taxes are used to provide public goods and welfare benefits to those who cannot afford them. Robin Hood policies, take from the rich and give to the poor. Should we give you the boots to pull yourself up from, or should we tell you to go find your own boots? What's the role of government with regard to economics? Is it to provide services, or is it just to make sure that everything is fair, yet to keep the marketplace open? Republicans would tend to favor free market and individualistic policies, where Democrats oftentimes favor redistributive policies, where you take from the rich and you give to the poor. So they favor generally policies with higher tax rates. And those are our sources of conflict. Another source of conflict is race, gender, and ethnic diversities. For instance, whites tend to vote Republican, Latinos and African Americans tend to vote Democrat. There's a gender gap, and the gender gap tends to favor Democrats with women and Republicans with men. Then we have to ask ourselves, are we a melting pot in the United States, or are we a stew pot? The melting pot theory says that when you are a citizen of the United States, when you come here as an immigrant or when you're born here, you are expected to give up whatever culture you or your family came from, or minimize it at the very least, and to jump into this big old pot where everybody's melted together and we all become something called an American, whatever that may be. The melting pot theory says that new Americans are expected to cast away their cultural traditions, values, and so forth, and to assimilate into that American dream, to jump into the melting pot and will be melted down. The stew pot theory says that new Americans should keep their cultural traditions, their values, and that they should be merged with other cultures, and that we identify Hispanic culture, African American culture, Polish culture, Russian culture, and Italian culture, and that you can identify those cultural elements and that you should embrace them. The textbook refers to this as multiculturalism. So that would be the stew pot theory. Someone who believes in multiculturalism believes in the stew pot theory. Why do we call it the stew pot theory? Because instead of everything being melted down into one glob, you have a bowl of caldo where you've got the corn and you've got all of the other vegetables and the meat and the bone all in the pot together, and it's okay for them to be different from each other because each has its own purpose. And there's a great debate between these two ideologies, multiculturalism, stew pot theory, and the melting pot theory, that says you're in America, you're American. Now, identity politics is where we identify with our ethnic or racial groups. And 74.2%, or 229 million people in this country, identify themselves as white. Another 16% as Hispanic, 10% Mexican, 1.5 Puerto Rican, 0.6 Cuban, 0.5 Dominican, 2.5% Hispanic or other. Black and African American is 12.6%, Asians 4.7%, and so forth. The idea here, though, is the number of people who identify themselves as white is going down. The number of people who identify themselves as ethnic minorities is going up, particularly Hispanics. Now, ideologies. An ideology is a cohesive set of ideas that allows someone to organize and evaluate the political world. It allows you, it's those ideas you have that interpret how you look at the world around you politically. A liberal is somebody who supports stronger government programs, greater market regulation, redistributive policies, taxing, and generally these ideas are associated with the Democratic Party. A conservative is someone who's identified with favoring lower taxes, free market economies, and a more limited role for government. And this is generally associated with the Republican Party. Now, is anyone truly a liberal or a conservative to the max, to the left or to the right? The further to the left and the right you go, the less you're going to be able to agree with each other, and that becomes a problem. So what you need to understand is that most of us are in the middle, what we would call moderate. Let's look at some cultural values. Culture wars define the idea that a political conflict in the United States is existing between red states and blue states. Red state Americans tend to have strong religious beliefs and strong conservative beliefs. Blue state Americans tend to be more secular, less religious. This goes beyond just religion, though. Red states tend to be conservative and center on Republican Party values. Blue states tend to be moderately liberal and centered on Democratic values, and particularly in Texas, even Democrats tend to be conservative. So this is our red states and our blue states based on the 2008 and 2012 elections. What I want you to notice, though, is that the Midwest and the center of the country tend to be your red states. Your blue states tend to be your coastal states, to the west and to the east and the northeast. So Texas is definitely a red state. But are we really a red and blue America? Are we truly this pure red, pure blue, opposites? Everybody is opposite from each other kind of nation? Or are we something like this? We call this the purpling of America. And if you look down beyond just the level of the state and you look to regions and you look to voting patterns, you will notice that the blues show up a lot more now, and that we're really not either red or blue, we're purple. So there are three key ideas for understanding politics. First, that politics is full of conflict, and that conflict and compromise are natural parts of politics and are necessary. Second, you're not going to avoid politics because it's everywhere. What happens in our government affects our lives on a daily basis. And third, that the political process makes a difference, it matters. And this defines how political conflicts are resolved. And if we can reach compromise, then this process is a good thing. If we reach policy gridlock, if we shut our government down to prove to the other side that we have the power, then we've got a problem. And that's what we need to understand. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of this lecture and this chapter.